Hello, everyone. This is Eileen Doherty, and I'm the director of the Colorado Gerontological Society. Excuse me, Society, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation on living with someone, family, friends, and roommates. This is part of our Aging in Place series, and we look forward to providing additional information. So as part of this presentation this afternoon, I thought it might be helpful to kind of look at a little bit around who owns homes as well as who rents them and what some of the differences are. And this might also help to instruct us as we go through the next couple of years looking at housing advocacy and housing policy. So at this point in time, according to some national statistics, 21% of the households are age 65 and over, as compared to homeowners who make up 79% of the households. So you can see there's a very distinct difference. In addition to that, if you look at the income, renters tend to only have a median income of around $28,000, which means half of the people make less than that, half of the people make more than that. Whereas if we look at homeowners, it's a $61,000 median income, much, much higher. Renters are also more likely to live alone, whereas older adults 80 and over are more likely to have lived in their home for 20 years or more. This too is extremely instructive because it helps us to think about who and how people are going to really react in terms of either living with someone or living alone. Those who are renters are more likely to rely on professional caregivers or outside support. So again, people who live in their own homes tend to have a greater or higher support system. That too can instruct us in terms of aging policy, because again, who is it we pay attention to and what does that look like? When we're looking at homeowners, we also see that many of them live in lower, denser communities, meaning there are going to be more people who live in either suburbs or communities or areas where there's lots of space rather than individuals who are living more in apartment kind of situations. Low-income households are on the rise. In the past 30 years, we can see that people in the labor force, 12.8% of the 65 to 69-year-olds are in the labor force, and 9.5% of the 70 to 74-year-olds. So again, where 40, 50 years ago, it was very accepted that someone who was 65 was going to basically retire, we find that more people are engaged in the labor force. These statistics also are reflective of the 2008 recession. I expect that we are going to see more changes, if you will, as we go through this current economic downturn associated with the pandemic. Lower income households also increased by 21% for people who are 65 to 69, and those who are 80 and over by 11%. So what that tells us basically is that, again, the World War II baby boomer generation was wealthier, was more likely to own their own homes than people who are entering into that lower end of the baby boomer generation. In terms of household wealth, we can also see that homeowners tend to have more wealth if they're 80 and over, whereas those people who are 50 to 64 tend to have less wealth or less equity in their homes. So when we look at really the wealth difference between renters and homeowners, it gets even more dramatic. What we see at this point in time is that homeowners have equity in the $152,000 of equity in their home and around $200,000 in cash. Whereas if we look at that related to individuals who are renters, they have obviously no home equity, and they have significantly less. We find that whites have about $11,000 in cash and minorities around $2,000 in cash if they are homeowners, whereas renters, whereas homeowners have significantly more. Even sort of what I would consider a middle or a very low to middle income renter of $15,000 to $30,000, they also only have around $3,600 in cash. Whereas somebody who is a homeowner will have around $88,000 in equity and $22,000 in cash. Again, from a policy perspective, what we can see is that people do not have a lot of wealth. They do not have a lot of earning power, and they do not have a lot of ability to leverage those services. So as we are looking at how do we create policy, we need to be really focusing on people who do not have equity and people who do not have wealth. The impact then of having very high housing costs is that we spend less money on food and less money on healthcare. The impact of that then again creates housing inequities because we are spending more of our dollars on housing and less on other necessities of life. Currently, one of the things that I thought might also be of interest is multi-generational households. And what we see from this chart is that Hispanics and Asians are more likely to live in three-generation households, whereas whites are almost not doing that at all. And the African American group lives in, shares housing about half the amount of Asian and Hispanic. Again, this makes for policy decisions that we need to begin to think of. Who's going to live together, who already does, what are some of the things that we can learn, what are the policies that we need to change and improve. I just found this particular chart to be also of interest in that many of the older adults who are living in multi-generational households or three-generational households also live in households with school-aged children. Again, I think sometimes when we tend to think of housing and living with other people, we tend to think of that as living with our adult children. But as you can see from this, a significant number also still have school-aged children. So let's turn our attention then for a little bit to moving in with family. So why would individuals want to move in with family? Well, some of the benefits, there's a lot of benefits, especially if people are older and are needing more support services. So having your family close and being able to just provide activities of daily living in your own home is very significant. Recently, I was consulting with a family, and although the daughter was only living 5 minutes away, as she described it, she was going to her parents 3 or 4 times a day with various things that they needed. So just knowing that they were in the house, she could run downstairs, she could run over the bedroom, provide a certain level of stress reduction and being able to provide services. Families who live together also often find it easier for them to be able to interact with caregivers and care providers. So it's a little bit easier to know when somebody goes to the doctor, to be able to talk to the doctor and the therapist to find out specifically what you need. You don't have to engage, if you will, in additional phone conversations, texts, going into e-health records and verifying information, whatever it is that you, however you get your information. Another thing that happens with moving in with family is that you can actually enjoy more family time. There is some issues around what does that look like? Is that sharing meals? Is that sharing activities? Is that going to community events? Just kind of what does that all look like? Other benefits that can happen if you want to move in with family is that you may be, as an individual, much more familiar with the your adult child's home. You're not moving into a strange environment where you're having to learn everything new. Moving is an extremely stressful event, and there are 5 or 6 events on the life events that cause stress, and one of the highest levels of creating stress for individuals is moving. As an older adult, many times people find moving to be extremely stressful. Families can also be much more flexible. One of the things to know is that if you move into an assisted living, into a retirement community, even into an apartment building, you will be entering into the world of an institution. Institutions, by definition, have rules. So it can be as minimal things in apartment buildings or retirement communities about what hours you can do the laundry, when you have to turn the television down, what kinds of decorations that you can hang in the windows, what kind of furniture you can put on your patio. All of those kinds of things can create the need for compliance. They may be easy to comply with, and they may require a lot of change. The more institutional that an individual engages in terms of if they move into an assisted living or a nursing home, they're going to find more rules and more need for compliance. Another thing that can happen sometimes when you move in with family is that it can save money, especially for an estate, if that is an objective. Other benefits is that sometimes you, as the older adult, can provide extra income for the adult child that you are living with. Some of the challenges about not moving in with family is that the family member may not want to provide care or services. They may also not be the best person to do that. So I can think of lots of examples in my life where I have known families to move together, and there were lots of conflicts simply because the expectation that you would provide a certain type of service was there on the part of the older adult, but not necessarily on the part of the family member. So I had a case recently where an adult father had moved in with his kids. He had some health issues, which resulted in him needing some surgery and becoming very weak. And after he had spent the days that he needed in skilled rehab and he needed to move home, what I found from the son and the son-in-law, or the daughter and the daughter-in-law and the son-in-law, was a lot of mixed messages. So what I saw happening was people would say, Well, he's my dad. I need to take care of him. But then when I would raise issues like, well, your father is going to need a bathroom where he can have a raised toilet seat, and he's going to need assistance pivoting in and out of bed, and he's going to need home care that is beyond what currently the Medicare home care is able to provide, then the son would say, but I'm not going to throw him out, but I can't do that. He has to do it for himself. And so there was a lot of conflict generated around that. Another thing that happens when you move in with family is that we as individuals usually use our home as a place where we can unwind, to be alone, to de-stress. And if you have a parent living with you or some other individuals in your home, that independence can be taken away, especially if the older adult is needing services and care. That can be sometimes a very big negative. You can also sometimes find yourself in for very increased responsibilities. For example, if you have a husband and wife who suddenly an older adult parent moves in, they may find that now they have to cook dinner every evening, whereas previously sometimes they may have either gone out or they may not have cooked a formal meal and just snacked on cereal or whatever. Other challenges that we find frequently are aging parents have a lot of habits. They have their own likes and dislikes, and they may or may not be willing or able to consider other members of the household, which really then sort of leads to who's in charge and who's in charge of what space. So determining within a household, if you have family members living with you, is what is your room, what is my room, what is common areas, and how are we going to share those common areas. Another thing that happens sometimes is we find ourselves where the individual is avoiding taking care of themselves. So, for example, I have a lady right now who lives by herself, and I can tell when I have visited her over the last few weeks that it is very difficult for her to get in and out of her chair and to manipulate her apartment. I am very sure that if she was living with family members, they would be getting up to get her pills. They would be getting up to bring her lunch, etc. Whereas because she is living in her own home, it is forcing her to get up. And over about a 3-week period, I have seen her become much more independent in a way that I was not sure she was going to be able to do, simply because her goal was to continue to live independently in her own apartment rather than to move in with family and others. One of the things that may also happen, and may be a detriment, if you will, for moving in with family, is that even though intellectually we think it may increase loneliness, it may actually decrease loneliness or increase loneliness. And the reason for that is that if someone is totally dependent on the family in which they're living with, for socialization, for transportation, and those kinds of things. So if the person is really not able to get out, to make their own phone calls, to be able to interact with others, they may find a move to be more challenging and more isolating than if they had continued to live independently in their own surroundings. Other challenges that go into living with family are emotional challenges. Moving is, as I said earlier, one of the most difficult life events. It is probably right under either losing a spouse to death or losing a spouse to a divorce in terms of life events. Um, some things that we also have to pay attention to is the parent-child power relationship. So, as growing up in our childhood, we all had parents, and there was usually not much discussion about who was in charge. Mom was in charge, dad was in charge, it was their house, and we as children complied with their rules. What happens if a parent moves into your home is that they may very easily either want to engage in that power relationship where they are the parent. And what we frequently see in terms of causing conflict is that the parent role of taking care of their children continues way beyond the children that they raised, that they want to continue to be able to offer those that protection and that support well beyond the need for a dependent child to need it. If an older adult is not conscious of that, if they have always been very authoritarian, they will also frequently find themselves exercising those roles within this new family dynamic. And that can be a very significant area of conflict and confusion. I had some family friends one time where the older mother moved in with the husband and wife, and the husband was also an extremely authoritarian person. But when mother told this adult daughter who had been married for 40 years that she should make sure and wear her mittens because it was cold outside, the authoritarian husband basically said, well, just remember, she's doing what she knows how to do, which is to be your mother. She does not know really in her role as living in your house and being either a colleague or being a shared member of the household. She doesn't know how to share that. So her role, as she sees it, is she still needs to be your mother. So reminding you of doing the things that she did in your childhood are the things she knows how to do. Personally, I thought that put a very important perspective on their relationship, and it probably took their relationship of one of conflict into one of appreciating each other and really trying to understand the different roles that people played in the family. Another reason that can be very challenging when older adults move into a house with adult children is guilt. I don't want to do this, but I have to do it because it's my mother. Anytime you are doing something like that out of guilt, you will probably end up in a situation that is not very healthy. Relationships that are built on guilt usually end up with winners and losers, and the loser is usually the person who feels guilty. It's not a healthy relationship because now you are not doing it. You are not interacting in a way that provides for authentic relationships. You're not true to each other. You're not doing it because you want to, but you're doing it because you have to. And that can be very stressful for the person who is feeling guilty. It also does not feel very good for the person who is receiving that help or support because, again, they will feel like they're a burden. So that's important. Family expectations are also very important. Some families will definitely tell you that I lived with or grandma lived with us, and I intend to live with my kids. Again, there's no questions asked. The adult daughter, the adult son, whoever is sort of tagged with that responsibility, there's an unwritten, if you will, rule that that is how the family dynamics are going to be carried out. And if that is the situation, then we also find um, that there is the opportunity for abuse, there's the opportunity for neglect, there's the opportunity for guilt, and a lot of very unhealthy family dynamics. Another thing to know when you live with other family members is that there's going to be some really good times. There's going to be opportunities to share. There's going to be opportunities to engage in conversations, to join in activities that you would not otherwise have been able to experience. But at the same time, for just as many good things, there will probably be bad things or bad events that happen. And those will also be shared. There's nothing like a shared experience, and shared experiences can be positive or they can be negative. Other things to look at when you move in with family are the costs. Sometimes there's just the actual cost of the move, and that move may be across country, it may be across the city. There may be costs associated with selling the home, costs with moving furniture, all kinds of costs, deposits, getting utilities in your name, just a variety of things. Sometimes, depending on the situation, you may also have to modify your home. So I know of many situations in which mothers or family members, older adults, will move into a basement or they'll move into an upstairs apartment, and that requires modifications associated with kitchens, egress, meeting zoning requirements, making it a livable space. So there's a lot of costs that sometimes go into moving into a home of another individual. Other things that you need to look at is that there will be, just by simply the fact that there are more people living in the household, there will be added food costs, there may be added utility costs. Remember that 3 showers a day versus 1 shower a day is going to use more water. You will have additional laundry to do. So those kinds of costs are not fixed costs, but rather those kinds of costs will increase as more people live in your household. You may also find that there are additional medical supplies that are required. This too can be burdensome, especially if the older adult has limited income and those supplies are not covered under Medicare or Medicaid. One expense that many people do not think about is that oxygen can be very expensive. So someone who is on oxygen 24/7 can find that the utility bills can increase significantly just by using the oxygen concentrators or whatever. So if you decide that you want to live with family members, kind of think about what your goals are and what do you want the outcome to be. So the very first question that you want to ask yourself is this a temporary arrangement or is this a permanent arrangement? Are you living there for a year or two while you can save money and then move out? Are you looking to live there for the rest of your days until you either may need care that your adult children are unable to provide, or do you plan to actually live out your last days in their home as well? And the other part of that question that needs to be very clearly discussed and described is, if I am the adult child, do I see this as a permanent or a temporary situation, and what am I able to provide? Another thing to look at is what happens if my situation changes. So you move in with me as the adult child, and I take care of my mother, but what happens if my husband dies? Or what happens if one of my adult children also needs to move back? Or what happens if I have to start suddenly taking care of a grandchild as well, because there's been a crisis? Or what happens if I get a new job and I don't have the flexibility that I had in the current job? So having discussions around how some of these kinds of, if you will, maybe anticipated or unanticipated situations, what that might look like, and what everybody is sort of semi in agreement intellectually about how to manage that. It doesn't mean that that's how you have to ultimately carry out the situation if there's changes in somebody's life situation, but it opens the door for those conversations. For example, in my own family, I have an adult son who has been living with us for many years now. And my expectation is that he and I will probably live together, just because of his situation, for the rest of my life. And our other children know and understand that that is probably the family structure that we will live within. Another very big thing that you have to discuss, and it has to be discussed openly, is how are you going to share expenses? Are you going to share them equally? Probably not, because most likely there will not be an equalization of income and or utilization of the resources. Another question as part of that is, if there are adult siblings, who is going to contribute monies, if any? So if I contribute my house, for example, and there is wear and tear and I make changes and accommodations, is that something that is a financial arrangement only between myself and my mother? Or is that an arrangement that is shared among family members? And if it is shared among family members, what does that look like? And there are no templates, there are no easy answers, if you will, to what that should look like. For every family, that needs to be discussed, and people need to know that it is safe and okay for them to express what they want out of this type of a living arrangement. Another thing that can get sometimes very sticky is if I am providing all of this informal caregiving to my mother, does that give me a higher proportion of access to the estate, if there is one? Or does it give me less? Do my siblings and I all share, even though I have equally, even though I may have put more into caring for my mother and have not been compensated? Other things that are important to understand in terms of not only the length and duration of this new family structure, but within this family structure, what am I willing to do? What do I have the skill sets to do? What am I willing to learn to do? So, for example, am I willing to give medications? Am I willing to provide incontinence care? Am I willing to provide transportation? A couple of years ago, I was involved with a family who had decided that they were going to keep the mother in her own home. There were 4 grandchildren and 3 adult children. One of the grandsons was willing with his girlfriend to move into grandma's house and to take care of her. But what I stressed as they worked out their family relationships was who is going to give this grandson and his girlfriend respite, and where are they going to go for respite? Grandma was at pretty high needs care, and so it was decided that the 3 adult children were going to contribute to a pot of money that the grandson and his girlfriend could use every other weekend for an extended 3-day weekend as a getaway. And that meant they could go to a hotel, they could go to an Airbnb, they could stack their credits if they wanted and take a 4 or 5-day trip. But basically, it provided respite for that grandson. And and then while the grandson left, then the adult children also took turns, and each one came every weekend. And then the other 3 grandchildren would also come. They took turns 1 week at a time, and they would come over and they would prepare meals every evening. So again, it was a way where the family structure was such that the live-in grandson was really able to maintain some sense of independence, as well as to be able to meet some of his own needs, if you will. Planning for future change is extremely important. So you have to make sure that you understand the energy that it takes to have another person in your household. And you may say that this is not a big deal, but if you live alone and suddenly mom comes to live with you, if you walk in the house at night and you don't feel like saying hello or having a smile on your face, mother may think that you are mad at her, and it may have nothing to do with her. It simply may mean that you had not a very good day at the office. So that kind of energy that it takes just to live with another person is important to think through when you are bringing someone into your home. As I said earlier, job responsibilities or job tasks may change. Health conditions of the older adult, if they deteriorate, who in fact is going to be responsible for those, and what do those look like? It's important as you plan for the future to really try to come up with some kind of a written agreement. This should not only include who's going to pay for what, but it can also include how and what the different relationships are going to look like. Once something is in writing, we usually feel, at least to a larger extent, that there is a little bit more commitment to follow through on those relationships. Everyone in this new family structure, whether it's the older adult, whether it's the adult child's spouse, and any other family members who live in the household or who are part of it, should always reserve the right to change this agreement depending on individuals' situations. In addition to living with family, another type of relationship sometimes that people are looking at is some type of roommate. This roommate situation can be either renting out a room in your current home, or it could be living with another roommate, either in a senior building or in a private apartment. Or we have seen a few situations, not many, where people will go together to actually purchase a new house. So the advantages of having a roommate is that there's always somebody around that you can call if there's an accident, if you need something, if you just want someone to talk to. It can provide for that type of just knowing that someone is there if you need help. It can also reduce isolation, and it can increase social interaction and activities. So depending on the kind of relationship that you're looking for, or that has evolved with roommates, sometimes people will create a situation where I just rent you a room. It's your room. You have use or common access to the kitchen and or to the living room or dining room or the laundry. But basically your space is only your space in your room, and that is very well defined. And I, as the homeowner, continue to maintain pretty much access over the rest of the facility or the home. Other people create a situation where there is shared access to the common rooms, and there's shared interaction and shared activities. Another thing that can happen if you have roommate situations is, again, there can be shared responsibilities for things like household chores, maintenance, and errands. This, again, works primarily if both parties still have their independence and are able to contribute to these situations. So I had an employee one time whose mother lived with her, and the mother was quite healthy at the point in time when she came to work for me. So the mother would take the children to school. She would do most of the cooking, and she would always had dinner ready in the evenings and did the laundry and those kind of household tasks, which allowed the employee initially to go back to school and get her bachelor's degree, and then eventually to come to work full time. However, as this employee worked for us, her mother became ill with cancer, and that entire dynamic had to change. And as the mother's health deteriorated, the daughter was finding that she had to take on more and more of the household chores, taking care of the children, and the mother was no longer really able to participate in any of the activities. The employee was very happy, though, because she was able to keep her mother in her own home, and ultimately she died on hospice in her home. If there is funding available, if the older adult has money, and you have someone living with you, you can also look at sharing living expenses. So you can split the rent, you can split the utilities, you can split the cost of lawn care, all of those kinds of things can be split. Roommates can also provide for daily companionship, somebody to check in with, someone to complain about your day, etc. Problems that have been associated sometimes with roommates are there's always a big financial risk if the individual does not pay the bills or their share of the bills, then what does that look like in terms of who is responsible for that? Does the person who is not able to pay the bills, do they move out? Are you expected to pay those bills because you're the roommate? If they move into your house, definitely you are going to be responsible. If you are primary on the lease, you are going to be responsible for those. If it's a lease in which both individuals are on the lease, then how does the landlord get paid? Say, for example, if one of the individuals is unable to pay their portion, or how do the utilities get paid if they're not able to pay their portion? Roommates can also put a stress on emotions and well-being, depending on what people, how people interact with each other. Some of the tips, if you will, to find a roommate is to really look at what are your expectations for a good roommate. So, for example, this happened many years ago, long before I was married. But my expectations for a roommate was that she would clean the kitchen, she would do the grocery or help with the grocery shopping, she would clean the bathroom in the house, and she would help with yard maintenance. Her expectation was that she would just, kind of live there. And if the dishes needed to be washed, well, at some point she might get to it, but it was not a daily expectation in any way, shape, or form. And I finally had to work out that it was my value system, that I wanted the dishes washed, I wanted the house cleaned, I wanted the bathroom cleaned on a weekly basis. And part of our lease agreement with the landlord said that we would provide lawn watering and some lawn services. And I finally had to agree that either she and I were no longer roommates, or I was going to have to take responsibility for those. Another thing you want to think about in terms of this relationship is, what are the deal breakers? At what point are you no longer able to consider having this individual as a roommate, whether it's prior to actually agreeing to be roommates or whether it's after that happens. So, for example, if you have a roommate and they take in a significant other, is that something that you are willing to be a part of or not? Is the individual financially stable, and are they able to pass a credit and a background check? Can they provide for their fair share of the expenses or the agreement that you have come to? Checking references is extremely important. And pay attention to who they list as references. Why would I put on a list of references people who are going to give me a bad reference? So try to think about the integrity of the individual who's giving the reference, and are they really being honest, and what is their style of really sort of sharing that information? See if you can get information around their communication styles, their cleanliness, but most of the time, this is not going to be maybe as helpful as one might like. Some people are also using internet searches to see if there's anything that is being posted on Facebook or any of the other internet platforms that might cause you to be concerned. Another thing to try to determine in terms of looking for a roommate is, are they really looking for somebody who can take care of them, either physically or mentally? And if so, is that something that you are willing to commit to? Other dues of living together are deciding who is going to do the cleaning, the organizing, and the care for the common spaces or even the other areas. Is something like sharing meals and having regularly scheduled meeting times or check-ins something that's important to you? And if so, what does that look like? It may feel really formal, but having that part of your institutional agreement with someone makes that structure much more positive and reduces the areas for conflict. There should be total agreement on food and smoking and pets and overnight guests and all of those kinds of things. Again, making sure that you have deposits and do not give out keys or anything like that, access to the house until you're really sure that this is what you want to do. And always create an exit strategy. Make sure that if someone wants to leave, that there is an open door and that that is something that can be easily managed. Do not harbor bad feelings if someone wants out, because it may not be you at all. It most likely is them and what they came to your home expecting or experiencing, and that has changed. There is something called a roommate template lease that if you want to use the link here, you can check that out. When you are doing room sharing, make sure that you look at what the lease looks like. Is it a master lease with subleases? Are you on the master lease and do you have subleases? Are you only leasing a room? And what does that mean? Leases are very complex legal documents. They are enforceable by the court. And so if you're leasing out or you're renting out a room, is that similar to renting an apartment? Most of the time it is. So again, you will want to look at a lease and make sure that you understand that. If there's a landlord involved, if you're going together to rent a single family apartment or a house or whatever, make sure that the landlord understands that it's two parties and what their responsibility is related to you and who's lead on the lease. Utilities. Recently, I was involved in a situation where Xcel Energy wanted something like an $800 deposit from somebody who had never had a public service account in their name. It had been in a spouse's name, but it had never been in their name. And that proved to be financially unviable for the people who were coming to live together. In Colorado, we have, or Denver, we have a couple of models of room sharing that two different organizations or companies have offer. One is called Silver Nest. This is primarily an online platform where if I have a room to share, I can list it. And if I am looking for a room, then I can go in and see what's available as the older adult or person 50, I believe it's 50 and over, who is looking to move in with someone. And they primarily use an online platform where they try to match different interests and requirements of the landlord with the requirements of the individual looking for housing. They then provide a way virtually for you to connect and eventually for you to connect in person or by phone. They also provide pre-printed leases. They can collect the deposit. They can collect the rent. So they do a lot of back-end support, if you will, for making your role as a landlord. If you decide that you want to rent out a room or two in your house, they can provide you with a lot of that kind of technical support to make that a relatively easy process if you wish to use those services. They also will assist with background checks and credit checks, and they can provide follow-up if you decide that you want to have the individual that you are looking at move into your home. A second model, which has some of the same benefits, if you will, it works a little bit differently in that they use a very focused screening and placement model. Social workers really do an in-depth screening process that is done more in person rather than through a computer matching process. And then they provide additional support in terms of background and credit checks and leases and those kinds of things. And the real difference there also is that they will provide ongoing support to both parties to make sure that the match continues to be beneficial. The last thing that I would like to do is to invite you to consider joining our Housing Advocacy Coalition. And we have a 3-year grant to really look at how do we help older adults to age in place. as we had started to have some of these conversations, we're really looking at things like rent support for individuals who need help and how do we prioritize older adults. Another thing that has come to the forefront is tax support, as we have seen increased taxes. Another thing is rental alternatives or housing alternatives, rather than constructing a $40 million building that can house 200 people or 20 people or whatever, is to really find ways that we can maybe provide some kinds of subsidies, tax support, financial support for people to continue to either stay in their own home or their apartment. Looking at ways to expand the Medicaid support, and or the in-home non-medical home care, that again, for those people who have funding or who qualify for Medicaid, this can be a support, but for those people who don't have those financial wherewithal to provide that, looking at some other options, and then looking really at state and local alternatives. Anybody wants to be involved in any of these, please feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to get you on our mailing list for the next session of the Housing Advocacy Coalition, which will be in June. And then our next Aging in Place series will also be the third Thursday of June, which I believe is June the 17th, and it will be from 1 to 2 p.m. So we look forward to having you join us. At this point in time, Maria, are there any questions?
There are no questions, Eileen.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to having you join us again in the future. See you on June the 17th. Thank you for sharing time with us this afternoon.